Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we are back talking about The Ghost and Molly McGee, and as promised, I'm getting around to doing my Season 1 episode ranking. And to be honest, it was a little tricky to put together, as I feel like for the most part the show is relatively strong, and there are relatively few episodes that I would consider outright bad. And on top of that, I feel like the show is so much centered around its comedic value that it makes a lot of this list pretty subjective at the end of the day, to where a lot of it is going to simply come down to my personal enjoyment of the show. But hey, I mean, that's probably why you're watching this video. Now, as of recording this, we obviously have the first season of the show, and there are 40 episodes to talk about. And for the sake of this list, I'm going to be considering the 11-minute segments to be considered an episode each. Now, I know that in a lot of cases, two episodes are aired at the same time and are more often than not bunched together. However, I'm going to be considering each of those segments to be its own episode. Now, granted, there are a few episodes that some would consider to be two-parters, as one leads directly into another. However, even then, I am still going to be considering those as separate episodes, as I feel like, well, that's how they're titled and that's how they're presented at the end of the day. So, like I said, there are 40 episodes to rank here, and let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 40, the worst episode of Molly McGee so far was kind of tricky for me to put together, as like I said, I don't feel like there are a ton of outright bad episodes of the show, as even the worst episodes do at least have something to offer for me. However, at number 40, we have the episode that offers the least value for me, and that is the bad boy Bobby Daniels. And to be honest, I just found this episode pretty boring, in my opinion. I mean, I didn't find a lot of the conflict particularly interesting. I mean, even Bobby Daniels, like, isn't the most riveting character in the world. I mean, I know a lot of his shtick is that he used to be this bad boy who has since gone soft because, well, he's an old man now. And even the whole conflict of Linda being revealed to be the one who drove Bobby away from Patty by forging this letter. I mean, I don't know. It's not the most interesting thing for me either. I mean, we saw Patty get pretty upset at her friend towards the end, and how she said there's going to be some words said once they get back to the place. So at the end of the day, I feel like this episode doesn't really offer too much, and I know there are people who will still say this episode isn't that bad, and to be fair, I 100% agree with that. However, if we're ranking these episodes, I just found it to be the most boring, didn't really draw me too much. So because of that, it is here at number 40. Now we're moving on to number 39, and we're already on an episode that people consider being part of a two-parter, as this episode immediately follows another one. And it is technically its own episode, but I still feel like it's vastly inferior to its first part. But here we have The Greatest Concert Ever. And similar to the bad boy Bobby McDaniel, I found this episode to be largely boring as well, as I didn't find it super interesting. Now, there is some commentary about the fact that you have Kenny Starr being this down to earth country star, or at least so he claims, when in reality, he is very much someone who is too good for the commoners, to the point where he even has a stunt double who rides to the concerts on a tour bus just so that like people don't like bog him down too much in case they actually have to get out for any reason. So I don't know. And even the ending where we find out that Scratch was able to infiltrate a tour bus, get it to the concert, and then it being revealed to be Atomic Pink, who was revealed earlier to be one of Daryl's favorite artists. I mean, even that twist was kind of underwhelming at the end of the day. I mean, I kind of get where they were coming from, and I can appreciate them setting it up, but I don't know. I just didn't find this episode too interesting for me either. Now, I will say the one thing that I do find slightly interesting about it is we do get some indication of Scratch growing more attached to Molly, as we see Molly get pretty dejected, getting pretty worried that her not getting Kenny Starr is going to make her unpopular. That's going to make a lot of the townspeople not very happy. And we do see Scratch come around, and that what motivates him to pull off the stunt of getting Atomic Pink to come to the concert instead. But I don't know. I just found that compared to all the other episodes of the series, I find it to be pretty underwhelming from an entertainment standpoint. So because of that, it is here at number 39. Now we're moving on to number 38, and I did actually consider putting this one at the very bottom, However, after thinking about some more, I do feel like there's at least some interesting aspects to it. But here we have game night. And similar to the last two episodes, I just wasn't that interested in the story and the reveal at the end that Sharon is actually really good at the Mega City game and how she was the reason that the game was hidden away to begin with. I mean, I didn't find that super interesting and actually kind of came out of nowhere, to be honest. And the song, even, like, I haven't even talked about the songs from the show. I feel like for the most part, the songs are pretty good. Although I will say that this one doesn't really do it for me. I mean, it's just saying win over and over, which was pretty underwhelming as well. Now, the main reason I did decide to bump it up a couple spots is I do find like the whole storyline of them trying to hide their willingness to play the game and them trying to break the tie is kind of interesting. Also, the fact that we see this game that you wouldn't think would be that entertaining, but they just find a way to make it both fun and very competitive. So, at least there's that. And similar to what I said about the greatest concert ever, we do get some indications of Scratch coming around to a degree. I mean, he kind of learns his lesson at the end of needing to do chores because that's what being part of a family is about. So I guess there's that. But at the end of the day, I just found this episode to be not super interesting, and the reveal could have used a lot more setup if I'm being perfectly honest. So because of that, I do have it here at number 38. Now we're moving on to number 37, and we have another episode that I just didn't find that interesting at the end of the day. And here we have Goat Your Own Way. And I will say that this episode, again, just isn't super interesting. It's your pretty standard story about how you can't just give like kids whatever they want, or in this case, a goat, as they're just going to become fat, lazy, and not really learn anything. So, I mean, Molly at least learns that lesson by the end, which is, again, good enough, I guess, but everything else just isn't that great. I mean, we see Scratch wanting to get all this food from the carnival only for it to like be taken away from him before he can even eat it, which I guess is something. This episode is constructed a bit better than the ones we just talked about, but even then, it's a pretty standard story. Didn't find it super duper interesting. So because of that, I do have it here at number 37. Now we're moving on to number 36, and we have another episode that I don't really care that much about. However, it does have at least one small positive to it. But here we have the turn of twist. And I don't know, this episode just isn't that enjoyable, especially when you consider the premise where the whole point of it is like Scratch trying to ruin the festival so that he isn't punished and sent to the flow of failed phantoms. And for the most part, that's what ends up happening, where the episode ends where Jeff and Scratch successfully ruin the festival, causing them to get a bad review in the magazine, and in turn, Pete becomes quite upset, and, it largely ends up happening according to plan. However, for whatever reason, the episode ends with one of the local hotels like getting its own booking because people apparently want to go to next year's festival because supposedly no publicity is bad publicity, and in turn that causes the happiness ratings to go up in Brighton anyway. So and I'm not entirely sure how that comes about. I mean, I guess it just comes down to no publicity is bad publicity. But I don't know. The episode itself is largely boring, where I don't really care too much about Scratch's play to ruin the festival, and the ending itself. I mean, I guess it's a way to try to make up for the mostly downer ending there, but even so, I didn't really care too much for it. Now, the main thing I will say is that it at least ties into the season long arc of Brighton becoming a happier place, and in turn, Scratch getting in more and more trouble from the council, culminating in the season finale. So at least there's that, but the episode itself just isn't really that interesting to me. So because of that, it is here at number 36. Now we're moving on to number 35. We have another episode that I don't really care that much about, although I can't say there are too many technical issues with it. But here we have All Systems No, and similar to the last couple episodes we talked about, I don't really care too much about the premise, and I feel like it just sets itself up for a lot of things going wrong. And sure enough, things do go wrong, like when Molly has to do stuff she doesn't really want to. And this just so happens to be the one day where the council ends up summoning Scratch for a promotion, and he has to say no to it. And in turn, like, we had to see Scratch like getting like messed around by the council again. Now, admittedly, I can kind of accept this, like if it's viewed through the lens of, oh well, the council knew that Scratch was doing this trick, so they just decided to mess with him by giving him this promotion when they didn't really have any intention of ever actually promoting him, knowing that he would be forced to say no. So I guess it kind of works when you view it that way, but still, a lot of this episode is just seeing these characters not having a lot of fun. And admittedly, the lesson itself is kind of like structurally sound. I mean, that you can't always say yes, you can't always say no, you can't live your life on extremes, but the episode itself just isn't very entertaining at the end of the day. So because of that, I do have to leave it here at number 35. Now we're moving on to number 34, and I feel like these next three episodes all have a pretty similar flaw in that they have at least one not so well thought out plot development towards the end that kind of makes things a little weird. But at number 34, we have The Best of Intentions. And for me, this is probably the most flawed of these grouping of episodes, in the sense that a lot of it is revolving around misdirection, where a lot of the episode revolves around Molly thinking that Sharon and Grandma Nin's tension stems from one thing, like Sharon wanting to become an artist instead of becoming a lawyer, or simply the fact that she got married to Pete, someone who Nin probably didn't approve of. And a lot of the episode does seem to support like at least one of those notions. But then the episode ends with pretty anticlimactic reveal where it turns out that Grandma Nin wanted Sharon to become an artist and is simply upset that she didn't pursue her dreams. I mean, to me, that was pretty underwhelming considering all the stuff that had been built up throughout a lot of the episode. And honestly, I think it might have been better if they actually doubled down and went down with one of those approaches to where either Sharon did become an artist against Grandma Nin's wishes, or maybe but Grandma Nin didn't actually approve of Pete, and in turn, Sharon eloped with him. I mean, because if you look at the rest of the episode, I mean, there's so many indications that Grandma Nin is at least bothered by one of those things, like the fact that she keeps giving a Pete a durian, even though he doesn't seem to like it that much, or the fact that Grandma Nin is so passive aggressive every time she brings up Sharon's art career. So I feel like it would have been better if they at least doubled down on it, although even then you're kind of venturing into some kind of darkish territory, probably a bit darker than what the show is going for here. But honestly, I felt like compared to what they set up, the actual resolution is pretty anticlimactic for me. But if we're looking at the rest of the episode, I mean, there's still some funny moments like Pete trying to eat the durian and paying Daryl to eat it for him. So there's that. And in turn, like the song itself is pretty alright. And the whole effort of Molly putting on a new wedding so that Grandma Ning will approve of them is pretty sweet. So there's some things about this episode that make it a little bit interesting, but it's the missed potential and the fact that they went for this misdirect that doesn't really add up when you look at how the rest of the episode goes. That does make me punish it quite a bit. So because of that, I do have to leave it here at number 34. Now we're moving on to number 33, and we have another episode that's kind of in a similar ballpark. And I'm actually a bit surprised this episode is as high as it is, as I don't remember liking this episode too much the first time I watched it. But on the rewatch, I did enjoy it a bit more. But here we have Twin Trouble. And this episode was pretty weird the first time I watched it. I mean, obviously, it's the episode where we see Pete's siblings and how they're always bullying him and really refusing to give him a break for a lot of it. And yeah, that did kind of wear me down a bit. I mean, also the fact that they're supposed to be from Boston and they're these like Irish stereotypes for a lot of it with these really thick accents. I mean, I'm not entirely sure where they were going there. I also found these sop goblins to be a pretty extraneous part of the plot. Like, I'm not entirely sure what they necessarily added other than really highlight just how miserable Pete is to be around like his older siblings. And in turn, we do get the like plot development of Daryl looking up to Billy and Jilly to the point where he starts to emulate them, while Pete is just like sitting there resigned, like unable to really do anything to stop like them from being a bad influence on his son. And we even get like some stuff like them dressing him up as this nerd type character, and they take him out to dinner, and then eventually he just stand up to them, like telling them that he's not going to take their bullying anymore. And then they just randomly break down crying, and it turns out that the whole reason they were like acting that way was because they were jealous of Pete to a degree, but at the same time, they really respected him a lot, which was kind of weird. I mean, it's almost like they were jealous of Pete, but they didn't want to make it seem like they were inferior in any way. So they just tried to bully him for a lot of it to really feel like they were showing his love there. So I did find that to be a little botched to a degree. I mean, it's an interesting idea, I guess. And I felt like if they had retooled it a little bit, it could have worked better. But as it is, I mean, the whole reveal at the end of them like feeling like their failures in life was a bit out of nowhere. And then on top of that, I did feel like the Sob Goblins was a bit much for this episode. I don't really see what they really added to the episode. But all things considered, I don't think this is as bad an episode as I was the first time I watched it. I do enjoy it a bit more now, but considering those issues, I can't have it too much higher. It is here at number 33. Now we're moving on to number 32, and we have another episode that's kind of in this category as well. Although I feel like there's a bit more justification for the, I guess, turn at the end. But here we have Ice Princess. And obviously for me, the big thing is that we have Sonia spending a lot of this episode feeling like she has to be perfect, and she really has this whole stake set up to where if Pete doesn't perform the act perfectly, then he's gonna die or whatever. But then after he screws it up towards the end, like she just is like, oh well, turns out I just wanted to have fun, and that's why I was missing it. Now I'm at peace. And that was a bit out of nowhere, but I kind of get it because we did see during the song that she was kind of getting into the act with Pete to the point where she was starting to realize that. So again, it's a bit more justified, but still, I felt like it came largely out of nowhere. And outside of that, I will admit that the whole premise isn't as interesting as something like a Twin Troubles, but I do think it was executed upon slightly in execution. So I do just give it the edge here. And because of that, I do have it here at number 32. Now we're moving on to number 31. And similar to Ice Princess, I'm a little surprised this episode is as high as it is, as admittedly, this is not the most interesting episode either, but it does have a couple positives going for it. But here we have the internship. And for me, I didn't really care too much for this episode either. I mean, a lot of it is Molly just working at this pawn shop, and she is trying to learn how this can help her in Happify things. And we do eventually have her learn at the end, like all the stuff that goes into the pawn shop, only for her to get a bad grade on her assignments. So, like it is what it is. But I will say one of the big positives for this episode is the song. I have no idea why, but this song is one of the catchiest in the entire show, and it's one that I like to listen to a lot. So, and I feel like it's one that's pretty central to Molly as a character. So I feel like that alone is what really propels this episode more so than anything else. And plus, there were a couple funny gags here and there that did make it a bit more enjoyable than it had any business being. But at the end of the day, it's still not my favorite episode, not my favorite premise in the world. And even the ending isn't the most ideal for me. So because of that, I do have it here at number 31. Now we're moving on to number 30, and we're kind of going back to one of the first episodes in the series here, but here we have the Unnatural. And to me, this is a pretty standard episode. I mean, basically just teaching a cheating is wrong moral when it comes to them trying to win the state championship. Mind you, I think the way they handle the actual execution of it is pretty funny, where it turns out that they really do rely on cheating for most of it. And even at the end, when they finally win by being honest, I mean, the whole reason they were even in that situation to begin with is because they were cheating. So there's that. Yeah, I can, admittedly, the song, I could kind of do without the song, to be honest. It wasn't really my thing. And the fact that they even had a reprise for it towards the end wasn't ideal either. Also, a couple of scenes were boring and not all the gags really hit for me. But it's the fact that they do kind of play around with the moral to a degree and just talk about some of the shortcomings with it, and in terms of how they actually win the championship and come around to learning the lesson, that does bump it up a bit for me, but still not my favorite. So it is here at number 30. Now we're moving on to number 29, and I feel like these next two episodes are pretty early episodes in the show, and ones that largely are meant to set up different settings and themes within the show, but on their own aren't the most entertaining in the world. But here at number 29, we do have getting the Bandshell back together, and this is technically part one of a two-parter from the greatest concert ever, which we talked a bit earlier about. And this episode is a bit more enjoyable than that one, as I feel like the actual story of Molly trying to get the town together to build the old Bandshell is pretty interesting. And just the whole idea of this being a thing to bring the community together and building this Bandshell is a bit more of an interesting prospect than just getting some random country star to show up for the concert. So I did find that aspect amusing. Now, admittedly, the actual resolution where we see the whole town come together after seemingly limited build up to the town being interested in wanting to build the Bandshell was a bit weird for me. However, I feel like this episode does give me enough enjoyment with its premise and somewhat an execution that does make it a bit higher in this list, so I do have it here at number 29. Now we're moving on to number 28, and we have a pretty similar episode to talk about. Again, pretty early on, one that sets up something that's continuing throughout the series, but here we have Mama's Got Hustle. And for me, I still see this one as largely exposition based, where a lot of it is just setting up Sharon becoming a worker for Gig Pig, which does become a story beat in future episodes. And it's not that this episode is boring per se. I mean, there's some pretty fun stuff with Daryl trying to find this new trapdoor to get to the world of the centipedes, only to break the water heater at the end and end up having Sharon to keep working at Gig Pig. So there's that. And at the end of the day, some of the gags are pretty funny with Sharon working at Gig Pig, so there's at least that. But at the end of the day, I still see this episode as mostly a foundational one that sets up future storylines, rather than one that is really entertaining in its own right. So I can't have it too high beyond this, but it is at least entertaining enough to where I'll have it here at number 28. Now we're moving on to number 27, and I feel like this definitely marks a shift in the list. I feel like the remaining episodes I would consider good and ones that I enjoy to varying degrees, and it really is just a matter of the order here. But at number 27, we have an episode that I'm not a massive fan of the premise, though I do find the execution somewhat interesting. But here we have A Very Hungry Ghost. And this is obviously a later episode in the show where Grandma Nin really talks about the Thai tradition of leaving food for hungry ghosts. And Scratch takes that to try to eat all the food for himself. But in doing so, he gets Jeffrey to bring along some other ghosts who end up eating all of his food. Now, admittedly, I'm not a huge fan of the joke of Scratch continually having all his food stolen by all the guests, and especially by the Ghost Council by the end of it. Although I do like the joke at the end where Grandma Nin feels bad for him and she orders pizza for him, and that seems to be enough to turn his spirits. So at least there's that. And I do find some of the jokes here interesting, like the fact that Scratch tells Jeffrey to tell nobody about the festival, only for him to take that as a double negative and to tell everyone about the festival, including the Ghost Council. So that is at least something that makes this episode somewhat humorous for me. But at the end of the day, I can't say it's my favorite episode of the show, so I do have to leave it here at number 27. Now we're moving on to number 26, and I do enjoy this episode a bit more than A Very Hungry Ghost, but at the end of the day, it's still not my favorite premise. But here we have Not So Honest Abe. And to me, this episode is a bit interesting, particularly with Molly working so hard on all the other people's presentations that she completely neglects to put her own presentation together. And she literally spends up all night trying to learn all she can about Lincoln, only for her to come up short. And then we see Scratch, really learning more about his standing within this ghost society. We learn that he's kind of not really well respected. And in turn, we do learn about this social hierarchy within the ghost realm that is kind of interesting when you think about it. The fact that people like Lincoln and the other past US presidents are sort of the elite of the society, and they're sort of sheltered off from the more normal people. And the fact that Scratch has to literally break his way into talking to Lincoln, and the fact that he has to keep pretending that he knows about Lincoln, and to the point where he gets Jeffrey to pretend he's Lincoln and then give Molly all the wrong information is at least somewhat interesting. But now obviously it does lead to Molly not doing super well in the presentation up until Scratch is able to get the actual Lincoln to come along, and of course Lincoln does. And now, admittedly, the song, I could do without. It's not the worst song in the world, but it's also not really my musical style, so there's that. And in general, I'm not a massive fan of this premise, though I will admit that in execution it does present some interesting lore, although I feel like future episodes do touch upon that better, particularly with how Scratch isn't a super well accepted member of the Ghost Society. So because of that, I do have this episode a bit lower, but I still enjoy it at the end of the day. So I have it here at number 26. Now we're moving on to number 25, and we're kind of going back to one of the earlier episodes of the show, and again, one that is meant to set things up more than anything else. Although I do enjoy this one a bit more than the ones we talked about not too long ago. But here we have Howling Harriet, which is Libby's formal introduction, although she did technically appear in First Day Frights, but we'll get to that episode later. But this is the episode where she becomes friends with Molly, and I always kind of enjoyed this episode to a degree. Now, admittedly, there are things I'm not as big a fan of. I mean, I was never a big fan of the song that plays towards the end of the episode. I mean, yeah, it's kind of cool seeing Libby like take the charge here and making these fake feet in order for Howling Harriet to like get the toes and then be reconciled with her spirit per se. But the actual song itself, not really my musical style. And in general, I find a lot of the premise here pretty predictable, where you can kind of tell that despite Libby not really meeting a lot of the criteria that Molly set out, that she would inevitably become Molly's pick by the end of the episode. So I did find that predictability to be a bit underwhelming as well. But still, I feel like this is a good enough introduction to Libby, even though this is technically her second episode. And I do like how Molly and Libby do become closer over the course of the episode. And we really do see how Molly comes around to seeing Libby as someone who is friend worthy. And I do always like the ending when Molly does formally ask Libby to be her friend and she accepts. So at least there's that. So there are things about this episode that I do like, and I do enjoy it more than some of the other episodes that may be set up more for setting up basic components of the show rather than being a story on its own. But there are still enough things to hold me back from putting it higher here. So because of that, I do have it here at number 25. Now we're moving on to number 24, and I'm actually a little surprised this episode is as high as it is, as for the longest time, I never really saw it as anything that special. And even now, I can't say it's necessarily my favorite episode, but I do think there are some pretty funny moments from this episode, and the actual story is not that bad. But here we have No Good Deed. And obviously, this is the episode where Molly is trying to teach Daryl how to be a good person, how to be nice, how to enhappify people. And it's very interesting seeing how Daryl basically takes all this and uses it to continue what he's doing, despite Molly not really envisioning that for him. And that even gets to the point where Daryl ends up sending the teachers to prison, thinking that the teachers are causing the kids misery, and in turn, that'll just make the kids happy. And then when Molly tells Daryl that, oh, well, that just makes the teachers upset, Daryl's reaction is like, wait, they have feelings? I don't know. I always found that moment to be pretty funny. Although it is sort of interesting how his plan ends up working out anyway, even within Molly's framework, as the teachers take this prison experience as their team building exercise that the principal talked about earlier. And in turn, they end up coming out of this working together more so than anything else. So in the end, they are a bit happier as well. So sort of humorous how Daryl's plan ended up working out anyway. And then obviously at the end, Daryl just takes this to mean, well, I can't be nice, so I'm just going to keep being myself and just hope it works out. So I don't know. I did find that to be pretty interesting as well. So there are some things about this episode that are pretty humorous in my personal opinion. But at the end of the day, I can't say this is my favorite episode in the world. I mean, the whole prison segment isn't the most interesting. The actual teachers conflict isn't the most interesting for me. And on top of that, it's not really realistic either, as no way the prisoners are just going to let these teachers just walk in when they have no records of them. So it is a bit of a flawed episode in that regard, but it is still one that I do enjoy a bit more than I expected. So because of that, I do have it a bit higher, and it is here at number 24. Now I'm moving on to number 23, and we have another pretty early episode to talk about here, but here we have Hooray for Mollywood. And I had a feeling this episode could have been a little bit higher had we gotten more indication that Andrea was actually enjoying the experience, like even as she was upsetting Molly with some of her antics. And to be fair, this is still a really early episode, and we do end up learning later on that Andrea has a very weird way of expressing herself. But I feel like in this episode, she is largely conceited. She is still largely in her, I guess, unreformed self. Even then, I wouldn't say Andrea has changed too much. It's more so that we just learn more about her over time. But, this episode is still a lot of fun with Molly like slowly like coming to terms with the fact that Andrea is just taking all the fun out of this up until her breaking point is when Andrea takes her chair, which was such a big deal for her. But I always enjoyed like certain aspects of this episode, like at the beginning when Molly is so confident in Libby that she gives her the lead role in the movie. There's that. And obviously, a lot of Andrea's antics are somewhat interesting, though not my personal favorite, if you ask me. And the ending is fine, where Scratch causes all this destruction and chaos, and we see them taking all that footage and then compiling it together into their own movie based on that. And we do get a bit of a cliffhanger where Libby does question why Carl doesn't have any strings, sort of setting up Libby eventually learning more about Scratch in the ghost world. So there is some things to be parsed here, but I feel like this episode probably isn't as enjoyable when you're watching it as what you might believe, especially when we do see Andrea talking later on the season about how Molly's her friend and how she's always enjoyed spending time with her. I feel like this episode could have done a better job at highlighting how Andrea is expressing her, I guess, excitement to be working with Molly and to have her as a friend. But for what it is, I still like this episode quite a bit. And I feel like the fact that it is this low on the list still reflects how strong the rest of these episodes are and how enjoyable a lot of them are. But it's due to the fact that I actually have to rank it that I do have to leave it here at number 23. Now we're moving on to number 22. And this is an episode that I always had a feeling was going to be lower compared to its competition, just given to the nature of how this episode is. And while it is still relatively lower, I do still enjoy it a good amount. But here we have The Jig is Up, the penultimate episode to the season, and the first part of the two-part season finale. I mean, if you want to look at it that way. And obviously, this episode suffers from the fact that a lot of its payoff does end up coming in the second part of it, which we'll be getting into later, where a lot of it is just setting up the stakes for what's going to be happening in part two. Now, I will say that the actual story itself isn't that bad, where we see like the Ghost Council finally picking up on the fact that the happiness levels in Brighton have gotten too high and they need to finally investigate. And we see Jinx coming along to really get on Scratch's case here. And I always enjoyed the fact that Jinx here is voiced by Liza Koshy, who played Zip in the MLP New Generation, which I know I haven't talked much about G5 of MLP on this channel, but I do plan to do so in the future, so I guess that's something to look forward to. But they did get a guest star to voice his character, and a lot of this episode is just your usual shenanigans of Jinx will see something suspicious, and then Scratch will have to come up with a whole bunch of lies in order to cover it up. And despite those lies not being the most convincing in the world, I mean, Jinx just kind of takes it for what it is and moves on. And of course, it's only towards the end where he really has to show his cards here by saving Molly, and in turn confirming the fact that he has an actual friendship with her to the point where Jinx ends up punishing her. And I'm sure from Molly's perspective, this whole situation was very confusing and just came out of nowhere here. So I guess that shock value from Molly's perspective is a bit interesting for me. But at the end of the day, I feel like this episode is largely one that is dependent on what's happening in the next episode. So we'll be getting to that soon. But it is still a good enough episode on its own. One that I feel like does set up the stakes pretty well and has a pretty dramatic cliffhanger towards the end that does set up that finale. So I do still reward it a decent amount. But I feel like compared to episodes we'll be talking about soon, there are definitely better ones for me. So because of that, I do have it here at number 22. Now we're moving on to number 21, and I'm a little surprised by how high this episode is. However, after thinking about some more, I do actually enjoy it a good amount. But here we have Citizen McGee, and this episode does a lot of things right. I do like the story where Molly becomes the mayor for a day, only for Stu to I guess, run away from his responsibilities and essentially make Molly this mayor for life. And after she realizes that a lot of her ideas suck and have immediate negative ramifications on the town, she realizes she needs to get Stu back. And I do like the resolution of how they bring back a lot of the ghosts of Stu's ancestors to basically give him a pep talk through song. And I actually kind of like the song, all things considered. It's actually a pretty sweet moment where all these ancestors are coming along and they're really making Stu feel like he's doing a good thing and that he's doing what he's meant to do. And by the end, like we see Stu come around, he realizes that this is what he wants to do, and in turn he's able to step back into that role. And I also like the shot at the end where it shows the paintings of these ancestors only for the ghosts to be superimposed over them. I always like that moment as well. So on the whole, I do find this a pretty wholesome episode and one that is pretty funny at points, particularly with some of Molly's ideas just completely going downhill immediately. Again, highlighting a lot of Molly's character flaws, of her over optimism getting in the way of reality at points. So I do like this episode a good amount, but I feel like other episodes definitely top it for sure. So because of that, I do have to leave it here at number 21. Now we're moving on to number 20, and I feel like this episode, even more so than Citizen McGee, is one that I can't believe is even this high, and especially given the nature of this episode. But I actually think it's pretty solid, all things considered. But actually, at number 20, we have The Curse. That's right, I have the pilot right in the middle of the pack here. And I am a little surprised this one's this high, as usually I don't view pilots too highly, especially when the show later goes on to build upon itself. I feel like the pilot usually has a lot to do in terms of setting things up, and there can be some opening for some early installment weirdness that is dropped in later episodes. And this episode definitely has that to a degree, particularly with Scratch's relationship with the council being a bit more casual here than what ends up being in future episodes. And at the end of the day, I can't have this episode super high because of the fact that the story potential is limited by the fact that it is the pilot. However, I still think this is a very good introduction to the series, all things considered. Like the way that introduces us to a lot of the characters and the premise of the show. Like, I always love the very premise of it being that Scratch curses Molly to uh, always be by her side and scaring her as long as they stay in this house, only for Molly to immediately flip it on its head by her feeling like this gives her a friend forever, to the point where Scratch says, I didn't curse Molly McGee, she cursed me. I don't know, I found that to be pretty interesting. And in general, this is, again, an episode that does a good job of setting the tone for the show, where it's mostly lighthearted, but also has some endearing moments here and there that makes it pretty wholesome. So I do like this episode a good amount, and for what it is, I feel like the episode holds up pretty well. But at the end of the day, I can't have it too much higher than this, and especially with the stories we'll be getting to soon having more interesting plot lines and interesting developments for these characters, I do have to leave this episode here at number 20. Now we're moving on to number 19, and we're back talking about another quote-unquote two-parter. However, this time we actually have one in which the second part is weaker than the first part, in my opinion. But here we have Friend Off. And I don't know, I feel like this episode could have had a bit of a stronger payoff, in my opinion, where a lot of it focuses on Libby and Scratch struggling to get along, and Molly's trying to basically force friendship between the two. And it essentially ends with the two of them bonding over how much Molly annoys them, which was a bit of a weird twist for me at the end of the day, and probably not super aligned with their actual relationship, but it was still an interesting twist that Molly ended up creating this, despite the fact that a lot of the episode focused on Molly being seen as the prize of all this, only for them to see her as a bit of an annoyance. But it was still a pretty solid episode. I mean, I like the fact that they work together to save Molly when she's about to be killed, so at least there's that. And I do still feel like this is a satisfying enough payoff for the first part, which we'll be getting into soon, but I still feel like it was a bit underwhelming for me, so I do have to leave it here at number 19. Now we're moving on to number 18, and we have another episode that's pretty good for the most part. However, again, it's not my personal favorite, but here we have Scare Tactics, and a lot of this is your typical skipping school, story where Scratch and Jeff decide to skip out on the seminar, saying, "Oh, well, every year they always repeat the same stuff." But then the one year they decided to do it, that's when they decided to make things completely different. And then Scratch has to basically deliver a test in front of the council without knowing what to do. But he ends up passing it anyway, which is pretty interesting at the end of the day. Now, the side plot here about Molly being scared by Daryl's spider probably isn't the most interesting storyline either, but on the whole, I still think this is a pretty effective episode and one that I do like a good amount, but it's not my personal favorite, so because of that, I do have it here at number 18. Now we're moving on to number 17, and we have a mostly lighthearted episode to get into here, but one that's pretty funny, all things considered. But here we have Innocent Until Proven Ghostly, and I said this before with my MLP ranking, but I'm not a huge fan of these stories where people get framed for crimes they didn't commit, and yet I actually found myself enjoying this episode a good amount. I mean, for one, it's a pretty small stakes episode. I mean, it's just over eating a cake, which no one really cared about outside of Pete, I guess. And I do like how over the course of the episode, we do learn how everyone was sort of guilty to some degree, where I mean, we heard Pete talking about how he had a different recipe and how he threw his other one away. We talked about Sharon, like, hating the cake. And then ultimately, Molly proves Scratch's innocence not by finding the actual culprit, but by revealing that Scratch has a carob allergy, which was pretty amusing at the end of the day, only to find out the very, very end that Jeff was the one to eat it, which pretty much had no setup, if I'm being perfectly honest. And I did find that element to be a bit underwhelming, even though it was still kind of unique in a way, so I will give it credit for that. But still, this is a somewhat funny episode. Like, even the fact that Daryl has a lawyer, like, during this case is pretty funny as well. So on the whole, I do find this to be a pretty lighthearted episode, one that's pretty funny for the most part, but I do enjoy other episodes more, so I have to leave it here at number 17. Now we're moving on to number 16, and I actually enjoy this episode quite a lot, as it has a pretty interesting story, all things considered. But here we have Ready, Set, Snow. And this is a pretty solid episode. I do like the actual story of Molly really pushing a lot of the people to get outside and have the perfect snow day when all they want to do is sit inside. And I actually find it very interesting when Molly is trying her best to spend all her time outside on her own, like really deluding herself into thinking this is a great day, when in reality the snow is piling on and it's getting really cold and she's clearly in a lot of pain, but she's just pushing through. And again, this is one of those episodes that really tests Molly's worldview, and one that really shows a lot of the downsides of it, where she is so set on her own way of making others happy and making herself happy that she can often do this to herself. So I did find that aspect to be pretty interesting. Now, the actual ending is somewhat fitting, but also, I don't know, a bit weird, where she finally comes inside and they actually have a pretty nice moment together. But then everyone just says, "Oh, well, we've been huddled up in here long enough. It's time to go outside," right when Molly wants to go inside. So, I mean, I don't know, not the ideal selection in my personal opinion, but again, the execution of it actually works pretty well, where they still have that moment together. I do like that quite a lot. So this is actually a pretty solid episode, all things considered. And again, the fact that this episode is still only here at number 16 shows how much I do enjoy this show. But considering the fact that I do like other episodes better, it does fall here to number 16. Now we're moving on to number 15, and we have an episode that's kind of similar to Ready, Set, Snow in a lot of ways, but is a bit more enjoyable in my eyes. But here we have The Don't Gooder. And for me, this is another largely enjoyable episode where we see some of the pitfalls and shortcomings of Molly's worldview, where for her, it's not just the fact that you're doing something good, it has to also be about the reasons, and her just getting so jealous of Andrea for getting all this credit for doing what seems to be pretty limited work is pretty interesting. And we see Molly really trying to expose Andrea at every opportunity, only to come up short. And eventually we have her discover that Andrea bought all of the candy bars for herself and had them mailed to herself in order to raise the most money and win the contest. And we see her almost attempt to expose Andrea and really humiliate her, only for her to see at the last moment that her parents don't really care that much for her. Now, this isn't like new per se. I mean, we have seen other characters in Andrea's archetype, like a Diamond Tiara or Pacifica, where, yeah, she is spoiled for the most part, but her parents are not very good. Mind you, I feel like the nature in which her parents are bad is slightly different, where it just seems like they're just so absorbed with themselves that they don't really notice Andrea half the time, which is a bit more interesting than them being outright abusive or them being so status oriented. Well, I guess here they are still status oriented, but still, the point stands. And we see Andrea just wanting to be noticed by them. And we see how quickly Molly goes from being all in on this plan to humiliate Andrea to her seeing Andrea being upset by her parents not noticing her. And in turn, she's like, oh boy, I made a mistake. And then she tries to get Scratch to stop Daryl from uploading the picture in front of the big screen. But then, despite it seeming like he saved the day, I mean, Daryl's like, oh, I already put up the picture. And then Molly has to explain away the picture and really prop up Andrea, where she gives a pretty good explanation of saying, oh, Andrea didn't want you all to get cavities, so she bought all the candy bars for herself so she could raise the money without having anyone getting sick or having to go to the dentist, which again was a pretty heartwarming moment, all things considered. And I do enjoy this episode quite a lot. I actually think it's a bit better than Ready Set Snow, a bit more entertaining, and just seeing Molly's transformation over the course of the episode was pretty amusing to see, as well as some learning a bit more about Andrea's character. But I still feel like other episodes top it for me in terms of my personal enjoyment. So because of that, I do have to leave it here at number 15. Now we're moving on to number 14, and we're now going from a slightly more serious episode to a bit more humorous episode. But here we have The Lucky Penny. And again, this is another episode that does focus quite a bit on Andre here, but mainly also on Libby and Molly. And I do enjoy this episode a lot as well. And I do like a lot of the explanations for how luck works, where there is this whole idea that luck is his like magical element, similar to what we see in the ghost world, where some people have good luck, some people have bad luck, and how too much good luck can lead to this weird vortex where people just steal all of the other people's good luck, which is a pretty funny dynamic. And I do like how this episode plays out, where early on, Molly is so willing to cheer up Libby for all her chronic bad luck, but then once the tables are turned, Molly isn't as pleased. So, I mean, there's that. And then we see Libby accidentally giving up the good luck penny to Andrea, or at least tripping and causing her to lose it. And in turn, Andrea getting all this good luck on top of the good luck that she naturally gets, all while everything else just goes completely downhill as everyone else loses their good luck. And one of the most iconic images for me is when Molly's seeing all the destruction take place as everyone else's fortunes are rapidly diminishing. I mean, she makes this face, and it is such a weird face where her eyes are wide open and she has this sort of grimace, but also like a straight lipped face. And it's just so funny to me. Like, I can't really explain it. But eventually, we see Libby be able to convince Andrea to give up the penny. And Andrea, the whole time, is just completely oblivious to all this good luck surrounding her. She doesn't even seem to realize just how good her luck is, which again is pretty fitting for her character. The fact that she is relatively privileged at the end of the day and is pretty oblivious to all the good fortune that she has. And I do like how Libby is able to convince her to hand over the penny by saying that she's working for this charity to raise money for kids who have too many toys. And despite this being a pretty blatant lie on Libby's end, Andrea just buys all in on it. And she talks about how she relates to the struggle of having too many toys, which again just highlights how oblivious she is, but also makes Andrea a pretty interesting character for me. And she does give up the penny, and all things are resolved. So I still find this episode to be pretty funny throughout, and I do like a lot of the ways in which Andrea acts in this episode and how she interacts with the story here, which makes it a pretty entertaining episode for me. But again, I still feel like there are other episodes that are better than it, so I have to leave it here at number 14. Now we're moving on to number 13, and we actually have the earliest episode left on the board to talk about, and here we have First Day Frights. And yeah, this is the second episode of the show, and I have it this high on the list. And I feel like this is a pretty good follow up to the pilot, where Scratch is still very much not on board with Molly and is really determined to make her life as miserable as possible to get her to leave the house and break the curse and get her out of his afterlife. And a lot of this episode is pretty entertaining where she obviously comes to school, we meet Andrea, and we see her screwing up Andrea's name, which again, the fact that Andrea is willing to let it slide the first time, but it's the fact that Molly does it a second time that really turns Andrea against her. I mean, there's that. Also, this is Libby's formal introduction here, where she talks about how she was outcast for mispronouncing Andrea's name as well. We see Scratch really being committed to making Molly's first day as miserable as possible to make it so that she doesn't want to stay in Brighton. And it kind of works to a degree, where Molly is pretty miserable for the most part. But then towards the end, we see Scratch eventually take over Andrea's body after she passes out. And then he basically fabricates this entire speech where Andrea seems to forgive Libby for mispronouncing her name, and by extension, forgiving Molly as well, who, again, committed a similar offense. And I did find that episode to be pretty interesting, how it is the first indication of Scratch growing and growing to care about Molly to the point where he completely changes his plan from like wanting to make Molly want to leave to making her not completely miserable. And plus, there's enough fun interactions with Andrea as well as Libby that does make this episode pretty entertaining for me, and definitely a step up from the pilot for me in terms of introducing a lot of these characters. But at the end of the day, it is still a relatively early episode, and there's still plenty of stuff that I feel like future episodes are able to build upon a bit better. So because of that, I do have to leave it here at number 13. Now we're moving on to number 12, and similar to Lucky Penny, we have a mostly light-hearted episode to get into here. But here we have Scaring is Caring, and this is a pretty weird episode for the most part, but one that is pretty enjoyable for the most part. We obviously have Scratch getting a bad case of joy, which in turn basically makes him this chibi, cute character for the most part, and I do like the transformation over the course of the episode, where at first it's just in his eyes, but then it turns into his voice, and by the end, like it becomes completely to the point where he is this unrecognizable cutesy character. And the fact that we see like him going around the ghost world and him going to the doctor and them freaking out over how cute he is pretty funny and leads to some pretty funny gags. And we see like him trying to cure it by basically making him have to live through his worst fear. And it's pretty interesting how towards the end, like Molly getting hurt is his worst fear. So the fact that he has to go through that and he has to break out of his cute form in order to save her is a pretty nice ending at the end of the day. And on the whole, this is a pretty lighthearted episode, one that is pretty entertaining and one that does set things up for the end of the season, where it becomes clear that he cares a lot for Molly to the point where like it starts to become a problem, and to where the point where the Ghost Council could potentially start to get on his case. But I still feel like other episodes are a bit more interesting for me, but this is still a very enjoyable episode, all things considered. So because of that, I do have it here at number 12. Now we're moving on to number 11, and I am a little surprised this episode is as high as it is, but again, when I ended up watching it, I ended up enjoying it quite a lot. But here we have All Night Plate, and this episode to me is a pretty good mix of comedy and wholesomeness, where the main plot of it is Molly really trying to build this memory of her, Libby, and Scratch watching this comet and staying up all night to do so. But in the process, we have a lot of Libby acting really strange, like she's acting like a knight from the medieval era for whatever reason. And I do find that pretty humorous in a lot of ways. A lot of shenanigans ensued with them trying to get Libby under control, but also trying to get her to actually stay up and experience the comet. So there's that. And things just going wrong along the way, like them losing their food. And then right as things are under control, Molly literally says, nothing can go wrong now. And then it just becomes overcast. But then towards the end, Scratch realizes how important this is to Molly, how she really did want to build this memory. And despite her being really insistent on it happening, despite it leading to some things going wrong, we do see Scratch really try to make this moment something for the two of them by turning himself into a hot air balloon and rising above the clouds to see it. And I always did like that scene where the three of them do sit above the clouds as they watch the comet go by. That is a pretty special moment as well. So for me, I feel like this episode is, again, pretty good at balancing the comedy, but also having plenty of wholesome moments along the way. Again, really showing a lot of the development that Scratch has gone through, but also, again, highlighting the more positive aspects of Molly, even as it highlights some of her flaws, namely the fact that she does want to bond with them and really have this moment as something that they can talk about forever. So, again, this is a very special episode, all things considered, but I did decide to leave it outside the top 10 as I feel like some of the gags didn't quite land for me, but also I feel like the top 10 episodes have a bit more to offer, so I did have to leave it right outside the top 10, and it's here at number 11. And with that, we are now inside the top 10, and for me, it's largely a matter of the order. I feel like all these episodes are pretty fantastic on their own, and they're ones that I really enjoy. But at number 10, we probably have the one that's the least impressive, but it's still pretty good on its own. But here we have Monumental Disaster. And for me, this episode reminds me a lot of Independence Day from Star Versus, where a lot of it focuses on historical inaccuracy and them dealing with the fact that they have a statue of someone who just wasn't that great at the end of the day, with Ezekiel Tugbottom being pretty lazy and a fake hero on his own, which is pretty interesting on its own. We obviously have Libby being a pretty good detective throughout a lot of it, with her being the one to figure out a lot of the stuff concerning Ezekiel's truth, as well as her, again, gains more suspicion about there being some supernatural stuff, which again sets things up for some future episodes. And I also think it's a story that ties very well into the show's premise, where we literally have ghost characters being able to show up. So obviously being able to see Ezekiel in the flesh and just seeing just how undeserving he is was pretty amusing as well. And on the whole, this was a pretty solid episode from beginning to end for me, and one that is rightfully inside the top 10. But I feel like each of the episodes we'll be talking about soon do a bit more for me, so because of that, I do have it here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we're actually moving on to a couple two-parter episodes in a row, and these are all pretty notable episodes in their own right. But at number 9, we actually have Molly versus the Ghost World, the season finale, and again, this is a pretty good culmination to the season, where we see Molly really get to see the ghost world for the first time in an effort to save Scratch. Now, again, as I talked about earlier with The Jig Is Up, I mean, I'm sure a lot of this came as a pretty big surprise to Molly. So obviously, this episode does focus on her response and her being the one to save the day here. Now, I do like the mechanism in which she gets to enter the ghost world, where her body essentially becomes this more or less zombified version of itself, where she's kind of dead. And the idea that she almost got sent to the flow of failed phantoms and could have actually died was a pretty interesting prospect on its own. But we see Molly going through the ghost world, and she eventually confronts the ghost council, and we eventually get to the scene where all three of them, Molly, Jeff, and Scratch, are all sent to the flow, only for her optimism to really shine through and destroy the flow. In the process, she even kind of kills the chairman as well. Now, obviously, it's not entirely clear whether he's fully dead or whether he's just in a different form. But considering the fact that we know that the chairman feeds off misery, I mean, the fact that she literally injected him with some optimism was enough to probably destroy him. And just seeing the council's reactions to the chairman's supposed death was pretty amusing, and they just let Molly go. So I found that pretty funny. But on the whole, I feel like this is a pretty fitting season finale, and one that was pretty consistent from beginning to end as well, and definitely one of the more enjoyable episodes as well. And because of that, I do have it here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and we have another two-parter to get into here. But here we have Out of House and Home, and this was another pretty interesting episode on its own. Now, I kind of like how a lot of the conflict is driven by the stream magician convincing Pete to work on the gutters, and in turn that's what causes the injury. And considering Molly's whole character quirk with her not liking magicians, the fact that he's the one that kickstarts this whole situation is pretty interesting on its own. But through that, I mean, Pete breaks his leg, and I like the gag that they make about the insurance, how they had to pay $700, and that's after insurance. So we obviously see a lot of the family working together to scrounge the money together. Now, I'm sure some people will compare this to Mama's God Hustle, where again, a lot of that story was also about them trying to make money to pay for something. However, I do like the angle that they go with here, with Scratch really picking up a lot of the slack of Sharon, where he's the one who's doing all the chores around the house. And it's to the point where he's almost treating Sharon like he's her daughter, which is pretty interesting. And it's pretty funny as well, seeing him just racing around and just completely losing it, while also comparing it to that earlier episode and seeing just how much Scratch has become a part of their family. And then we get to the ending, which is obviously one of the more unique endings in the show so far, where they literally do the stinger that goes to Molly McGee, but then stop midway to have the big twist of them losing their house because they couldn't pay the mortgage. And I always find that ending to be pretty interesting, with them like having to move out of the house, and then Molly gets pretty sad and just walks off, and then it just silently cuts to black as it leads right into the next episode, which I haven't talked about yet, but we'll get to that soon enough. So on the whole, this is another very interesting episode, one that I feel like both the first part and the second part are very compelling, very entertaining, and have a lot of interesting stuff going on. And that's a big reason why this episode in particular is inside the top 10. But again, a lot of it does come down to my personal enjoyment, and the fact that this episode is only number 8 kind of shows where we're going from here. So because of that, I do have it here at number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7, and we have another two-parter to get into right here. But here we have Scratch the Surface, and this is obviously a pretty notable episode in the series, with it being the one where Libby kind of finds out about Scratch, although that's kind of explored more in Friend Off. But a lot of this is Molly just trying to keep this all a secret from Libby, despite the fact that this episode, along with some previous episodes, hinted at Libby picking up on some weird stuff happening around town. And the conflict here is pretty interesting, where Molly wants to tell Libby about Scratch's existence, but Scratch is pretty against it, because if Libby knew about him, then she wouldn't be so scared by him, which in turn reduces his potential to keep the misery levels low in Brighton, which could in turn get him sent to the flow. So through that, I mean, Molly is pretty stuck here, with her trying to choose between lying to Libby and potentially putting Scratch into danger here. And it's interesting as well, where she's so willing to like not deal with this conflict that she'd rather just go away and pretend to be this transfer student. And it's always interesting seeing Molly pretending to lie in front of Libby, pretending to be this Canadian, and with Libby pushing her so far, like having her eat an entire burger covered in maple syrup. I find that joke to be pretty funny. And the song itself is pretty good as well, where Molly says that no matter what she does, she'll be letting someone down and she won't be feeling pretty good. And then the ending was pretty impactful as well, where Scratch finally reveals himself, and then Libby just faints out of the pure shock out of it. So again, this is a very enjoyable episode as well, similar to the other two parters we just talked about, in that it sets itself up well for the next episode, but also is a pretty interesting story on its own. And while I do admit that the second part wasn't as interesting as this episode, it's still pretty impactful, and a big reason I have it here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and this technically isn't a two-parter, although it is technically related to another episode due to it taking place around the same time. But here we have Saving Christmas, and this was a pretty well-balanced episode for me, where it definitely has a lot of entertainment going on, with Molly and Scratch trying to pull off a Christmas Carol stunt to Mr. Davenport to get him to not cancel the festival, and then it just completely going downhill with him refusing to see the point, and just him like constantly having his life in danger by him being dropped all over the place. I find that very funny and very interesting play on the Christmas Carol trope. Obviously, a big part of the episode is Molly getting pretty upset when the festival isn't being put back on, and Scratch being so motivated to help her that he ends up summoning the Christmas spirit to the town in order to get Mr. Davenport to get back on board with sponsoring it. And the other key part of it is Andrea. And I know some people will say that Andrea is still being pretty selfish here, where the whole reason why she wants to have the festival take place is so that she can be the snowflake queen when her mother was one when she was a child. Again, not really anything too selfless here, as again, she wants to be the snowflake queen. However, considering what we know about Andrea and her relationship to her parents, I can understand her motivation here. And it's pretty interesting as well, seeing Molly being receptive to this. And at the end, when Andrea does get to become the snowflake queen, she seems pretty appreciative of what Molly does here. So again, I feel like it's a pretty realistic step of character development for Andrea, where again, she's still being motivated by things you would expect her to be, namely her being selfish and whatever, but it's at least motivated in areas that make it pretty interesting. And then when she gets her wish, like she does show her appreciation, and through that, we see a growing friendship between her and Molly. So this episode definitely has a lot going on, plenty of humor, but also plenty of interesting character stuff going on. That does make it one of the top of episodes for me, but I feel like the top five are a bit more entertaining for me. So because of that, I do have it here at number six. Now we're moving on to number five, and I'm sure this may come off as a weird pick for number five, as it's definitely one that isn't quite fitting with the rest of the top five, but I just love this episode a lot. But here we have Lock, Stock, and Peril. And to me, this was probably the funniest episode of the series up to this point, where I found myself consistently entertained from start to finish. Where we obviously have the main story of Molly and Scratch going around town to get some help to unlock the basement door to let out the rest of the family, but she keeps getting distracted. And a lot of those gags there are pretty good, like when she's trying to get lemonade and the kid there is just pouring it really slowly because everything has to be made fresh. I find that pretty good. Just seeing Molly getting naturally distracted by all kinds of stuff, despite her best instincts telling her that she needs to keep going. I mean, I find that pretty interesting. The song itself is also pretty good, where she's trying to get back home with Larry so that he can unlock the basement, but her just turning down opportunity after opportunity to get sidetracked is pretty good. And then the side plot as well, where we actually see the family locked up in the basement, was pretty funny as well, where we see them sort of breaking off into these warring tribal nations where each of them are fighting for supplies, and then they each slowly lose their minds until they're eventually just fighting against each other, which was very funny to watch. So I know that this episode doesn't quite fit in with certain other episodes inside the top 10 and particularly the top 5 once we get into it. But I just had such a blast watching this episode. It's really one that highlights a lot of the comedy of the show that I have to give it its due credit. So because of that, I do have it here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and for me, this is the definitive top 4. I feel like these are my 4 favorite episodes of Molly McGee up to this point, and it's really just a matter of the order. But here we have a pretty notable episode for me, and here we have the talent show. And this was a pretty strong episode for me, one that really highlights Molly and Libby's friendship here, and Molly really wanted to help Libby step more into the sun here. And for me, Libby wanted to be in the talent show isn't just her wanting to be more out there and a bit more confident, but it's also to make her mom proud, as we see throughout the episode that Libby's mom is very proud of Libby for taking the step forward and wanting to be a part of the show. And that's something that I always found pretty endearing. But of course, we have Libby being pretty terrible at singing, and I love each of the scenes where Libby is trying to sing the song, but it's just so bad across every front, and we eventually see Molly attempt to stop Libby from performing, but Libby is just determined to get on stage no matter what. And eventually, Molly does tell Libby that she sucks at singing, and Molly tries to pass this off as her not wanting to hurt Libby's feelings, only for Libby to point out that she should have told her a bit sooner than right before she was going to go on stage. But through this, Libby is able to turn it around and basically turn the song that she was able to sing into a poem that she recites. And I always love the scene where Libby performs and recites the poem. It's one of the most impactful scenes between her delivery and the music that plays in the background. It's just really a nice moment for me. And obviously, it goes off very well. The people love it, and we see just how proud Libby's mom is of her. And that's a very, very sweet moment for me. And again, I feel like this is definitely one of my favorite episodes of the show because it highlights a lot of the heart that the show has, as that's something that really drives a lot of these characters for a lot of it. And of course, we obviously have Scratch wanting to keep the misery levels down by having Libby embarrass herself anyway, only for Molly to stop her, which was an interesting side plot as well. So at the end of the day, this is a pretty solid episode and one that is one of my favorites, one that holds up even after seeing a lot of the other episodes from season one. But I feel like the top three have a bit more to offer, so I do have to leave it here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and again, we have another very solid episode, and we have the final two-parter left to talk about, and here we have Home is Where the Haunt Is. And for me, this is definitely a very strong follow-up to Out of House and Home, where we have two things going on. We obviously have the side plot of Scratch trying to make the house haunted to prevent anyone else from moving in, and we see Candace really trying to sell this house at any cost. And then it gets to the point even where she's selling it to, I guess, goth people who would actually be into the fact that it's haunted to try to get around Scratch. So I find that storyline to be pretty interesting. But then we get to the main story where Molly and the family are homeless and living in the woods. And we see Molly really spend a lot of this episode trying to hide the fact that she's homeless to a lot of people. Like, she tries hiding it from Libby for a lot of it, and she tries hiding it from Andrea, especially of all people. And we see her like doing all this stuff to try and avoid going back, quote unquote, home, like her picking up all these extracurriculars and making it so apparent that she is being like overburdened by all these extracurriculars that she's taking on, and how she very desperately doesn't want to go home. It kind of reminds me of Twilight from Castle Sweet Castle, where she does all this stuff and wears herself thin just to avoid going home. Only this time it's even more stark in that, well, Molly is ashamed of the fact that she's homeless. And I do find her song very interesting, where she keeps insisting that she's fine, despite the fact that Libby picks up on the fact that she, well, isn't fine. And a lot of it is understandable too, in that Molly doesn't want others to be upset by the fact that she doesn't have a home to go home to, and that she would rather see herself as someone where everything is fine. It's almost as if she's trying to convince herself that everything is fine when she clearly isn't happy at all, and she doesn't want to pass it on to anyone else. And eventually Andrea does find out the truth, and Molly tries very desperately to avoid Andrea spreading the attention, and then feeling like she really like spread the bad news around to where others are going to feel bad for her. But ultimately Andrea does buy the house back, or more specifically, she crowdfunds them being able to buy the house back. And it's always a pretty endearing moment where Andrea says that Molly is her friend and that she really worked hard to make sure that Molly did have a home to go home to. And then we have the moment at the very end where we find out that the curse has technically been broken because Molly did leave the house, and yet Scratch tries to pretend like the curse is still in effect, which was always a pretty nice one as well. Again, highlighting Scratch's character development. So for me, this was a very entertaining episode as well, and definitely one of my favorites as well, and a big reason that it is here inside the top 5. But I feel like the top 2 are a bit more interesting from a personal perspective for me. So because of that, I do have it here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I always knew coming into this list that this was going to be really high, as I loved this episode the first time that I watched it, and I feel like over the course of watching the other episodes that it really has held up. But number 2, we actually have a relatively early episode left to talk about, but here we have Mazel Tov Libby. And I'm sure a lot of people were expecting this episode to be pretty high, and for good reason. It is a great episode. For one, it has the best song in the entire series, My Best Friend's Bat Mitzvah, which is so catchy and has really great visuals throughout it. And it has a great instrumental reprise that plays later on when Molly is redecorating the Bat Mitzvah, which is always a pretty nice moment. And then we get to the actual Bat Mitzvah where Libby intentionally invited relatively few people because she didn't want that many people there to begin with. And it's always nice that Libby specifically invited Molly because Molly is her friend and she wanted her to be there of all people. But then we see Molly get this misunderstanding that the whole reason the bat mitzvah is small is because the bookstore is failing and how her family has fallen into hard times. So Molly tries to make up for it by the fact of inviting all these people, but also redecorating it. And we see Libby just not get into it at all. And we see her gradually becoming more anxious to the point where she eventually breaks down. And that's always a pretty impactful scene as well, when Libby is crying at her own bat mitzvah and Molly does like talk to her, and it turns out that Libby wanted a small bat mitzvah this whole time because she doesn't want to be around all these people, and that makes her very nervous, and that she wanted to spend time doing what she wanted rather than what Molly thinks would be a good time. And we eventually see Molly convince Scratch to scare everyone off by unleashing all the bats. And then Libby walks away from it feeling like she was the one who stood up for herself and really indicating the fact that she's a grown woman now, which I always found that moment pretty amusing as well. So, on the whole, this is a very solid episode. Definitely one of the best of the series for me, and definitely one of my favorites. I mean, it's a very endearing story for the most part, and one that has a very solid song. And again, I'm sure a lot of people will agree with me here, but I feel like one episode does top it in almost every regard. So because of that, I do have it here at number 2. And now at number 1, the best episode of Molly McGee season 1, in my opinion, is Festival of Lights. And I'm sure some people saw this coming as well. And I actually debated between this one and Mazel Tov Libby, as to me, I feel like these episodes give off very similar vibes for the most part. Obviously, a lot of it focuses on Libby and the fact that she's Jewish and focusing on various Jewish traditions. And we obviously learn quite a bit about Libby's family in both episodes, where in Mazel Tov Libby, we see a very noticeable absence in Libby's father from this event, which has raised speculation that like he's just not in the picture for whatever reason. Well, this episode obviously delves more into their Hanukkah traditions and shares some stories as well, such as her great grandparents like leaving for America. And obviously, that's pretty interesting as well. And we do focus quite a bit on her friendship with Molly, which really for me is the highlight of these episodes anyway. However, I think what really puts this episode above Mazel Tov Libby for me is the fact that it has a very interesting atmosphere. If I had to describe this episode in one word, it would probably be cozy. I mean, this episode does obviously take place entirely inside their bookstore, and we see the characters like really trying to make the most out of this blackout during the last night of Hanukkah, and them just spending time together the best that they can, literally going hour by hour. And we have some pretty notable scenes. Like, again, we had the scene of them telling the story of Libby's great grandparents. We had the scene where Libby is reciting a poem, which was pretty interesting on its own, especially knowing that Libby is known to engage in some public poetry. We obviously have the miracle box scene, which is a very notable scene, particularly when Scratch is so embarrassed to reveal what his is, as he wasn't expecting others to read them, only for him to say, "I used to haunt a house, now I haunt a home." And this episode is very effective at creating an atmosphere that really is unique for the rest of the series. And I talk a lot about how this show, what makes it pretty effective above all else, beyond its comedy, is its characters and its heart. And I feel like this episode really encapsulates everything that I just mentioned here. Now, admittedly, I still feel like Mazel Tov Libby has a better song, but I feel like everything else within Festival of Lights makes it above it in a lot of ways, to where it is a more enjoyable episode to watch for me, one that has a bit more going on, and that's a big reason that it is my favorite episode of season 1, and one that will probably hold up over time. So because of that, I do have it here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out with the channel. Obviously be back talking about other shows that I watch, particularly MLP. I do have some more Total Drama videos planned, so stay tuned for those. And I do have at least some other videos from Molly McGee planned for the future, so you can look forward to those. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server. I'll leave a link to join in the description. A lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that's the video. See ya.